I, 36F, have been married to Clark, 38M, for 12 years. We first met at a bank where we both worked as financial analysts. Clark was different from other bankers. While everyone else talked about investments and market trends, he would talk about his dream of opening a bakery. Initially, I found his passion for baking endearing. It was refreshing to see someone in our field who had interests beyond spreadsheets and profit margins. Let me give you some background about Clark. Even before we got married, he would spend his weekends experimenting with different recipes. Our dates often involved him bringing homemade cupcakes, muffins, or cookies. He was good at baking, I'll give him that. His chocolate chip cookies were legendary in our office, and he often got requests from colleagues to bake for their special occasions. However, Clark was not a business-minded person. He was innocent, naive, and too trusting of others. I discovered this early in our relationship when he tried to start an online craft business. He invested $5,000 in materials after a supplier promised him exclusive handmade items at wholesale prices. The items turned out to be cheap mass-produced stuff from China, worth barely $500. Clark was too embarrassed to take legal action and ended up donating everything to a local church. 2 years after that, he tried to open a small flower shop. This time, he partnered with a friend who claimed to know the flower business. The friend convinced Clark to invest $10,000 for initial inventory and supplies. 3 months later, the friend disappeared with all the money, leaving Clark with nothing but excuses to make to his family who had lent him the money. After these failures, I convinced Clark to focus on his banking career instead. He was actually good at his job when he focused on it. He got promoted twice in 3 years and was respected by his colleagues. But the dream of opening his own business, especially a bakery, never really went away. He would often browse through restaurant equipment catalogs or spend hours watching videos about bakery management. Last year, Clark started attending weekend cooking workshops at our local community center. That's where he met Beyoncé, 34F. She introduced herself as a professional chef who had worked at several high-end restaurants in New York and Los Angeles. According to Clark, she had an impressive resume, trained in Paris, worked under famous chefs, managed multiple successful restaurants. She seemed to know everything about the restaurant business. Clark was immediately impressed by her. He started attending more workshops just to learn from her. Soon they began discussing the possibility of opening a bakery together. According to their plan, Clark would handle the baking while Beyoncé would manage the business side of things. She claimed she had contacts with suppliers and knew all the right people in the local restaurant scene. When Clark first mentioned this partnership to me, I immediately said no. Something about Beyoncé seemed off to me. She claimed to have worked at Le Bernardin in New York, but when I casually mentioned Thomas Keller, the famous chef, she got confused and said she had worked under him there. Anyone who knows anything about restaurants knows that Thomas Keller has never worked at Le Bernardin. When I pointed this out to Clark, he dismissed it as a simple mistake. I tried to research Beyoncé online but couldn't find any trace of her supposed illustrious career. No mentions in restaurant reviews, no social media presence from her time at these famous restaurants, nothing. When I told Clark about this, he accused me of stalking his friend and not trusting his judgment. Our arguments about the bakery became more frequent and intense. Clark spent more and more time with Beyoncé, discussing business plans and recipes. He would come home late, saying they were looking at potential locations or meeting with suppliers. I felt like I was losing my husband to this woman and her empty promises. The situation got worse when Clark started talking about using our savings for the bakery. We had about $50,000 saved up, which we were planning to use as a down payment for a house. Clark wanted to use all of it as initial capital for the bakery. When I refused, he got angry and said I was crushing his dreams again. He accused me of being controlling and never supporting his passions. We had a huge fight about it. Clark said I was just like his parents, always telling him to play it safe and never take risks. He said he was tired of living someone else's life and wanted to finally do something for himself. When I reminded him of his previous failed ventures, he stormed out and didn't come home that night. The next day, Clark came back and apologized. He said he understood my concerns and wouldn't touch our savings. He promised to find other ways to fund his dream. I thought the matter was settled, but looking back, I should have known better. Clark started acting differently, taking phone calls outside, being protective of his phone, making excuses to miss our usual dinner dates. I didn't question him too much about these changes. After our big fight, I was afraid of starting another argument. Plus, I trusted Clark. Despite his naive nature and failed business attempts, he had never been dishonest with me. I thought he was just taking some time to accept that his bakery dream would have to wait. But now I realize I was too trusting. Clark was planning something behind my back, something that would change our marriage forever. I never thought he would betray my trust in such a devastating way, but I guess you never really know what people are capable of when they're desperate. I'll keep you updated on what happens next. For now, I'm trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Should I have been more supportive of his dreams? Was I too controlling? I don't think so, but maybe I'm wrong. What would you do if you were in my situation? Update 1. Thank you everyone for your supportive comments on my last post. A lot has happened since then, and unfortunately, none of it is good. Remember how I mentioned Clark was acting secretive? Well, now I know why, and it's far worse than I imagined. Remember my father's 1967 Ford Mustang? My dad spent 15 years restoring that car. Every weekend, he would work on it, and I would sit in the garage, watching him, learning about each part. He taught me everything about that car, its history, how to maintain it, even how to fix minor issues. When Dad was diagnosed with cancer 5 years ago, he made me promise to keep the car in the family. It was his legacy, he said. When he passed away, he left it to me in his will. That car was my connection to Dad. Whenever I missed him, I would go to the garage, sit in the driver's seat, and remember all the times we spent together working on it. The smell of leather and old metal always brought back memories of him. Clark knew all this. He knew how much that car meant to me. He had seen me cry in that car on Dad's death anniversary. He had held me while I talked about missing Dad. Last weekend, I went to the garage to clean the car, something I did every month without fail. But when I opened the garage door, the car was gone. At first, I thought I was in some kind of nightmare. I even closed my eyes and opened them again, expecting the car to reappear. But it didn't. The garage was empty except for some oil stains on the concrete floor where the car used to be. I ran back into the house, calling for Clark. He was in the kitchen, and when he saw my face, he knew I had discovered what he'd done. Before I could say anything, he started explaining, or rather, trying to justify his actions. He had sold the car for $75,000 to start his bakery with Beyoncé. According to Clark, this was his only option after I refused to let him use our savings. He said he did it because he was tired of me controlling his life and crushing his dreams. He actually had the audacity to say that the car was just sitting in the garage gathering dust, and at least now it was being put to good use. Can you believe that? He talked about my father's car, my inheritance, my most precious possession, like it was just some old junk taking up space. I was in shock. I couldn't speak, couldn't even cry. I just stood there, staring at him, wondering who this person was and what he had done with my husband. The Clark I married would never have done something so cruel, so thoughtless. But the worst was yet to come. Yesterday, Clark came home early from his meeting with Beyoncé. The moment I saw him, I knew something was wrong. He looked completely broken, like someone had just destroyed his whole world. Turns out, Beyoncé wasn't who she claimed to be. She wasn't a chef at all. She had never worked in any restaurant, let alone the famous one she claimed to have worked at. She was a con artist who had done this before to other aspiring restaurant owners. After Clark transferred the money from the car sale to their joint business account, Beyoncé cleaned it out and disappeared. She even took the $15,000 deposit they had put down on the bakery location. Clark lost everything, the $75,000 from my dad's car, plus another $20,000 he had borrowed from his brother for equipment purchases. Now Clark is crying and begging for forgiveness. He keeps saying how sorry he is, how stupid he was, how he should have listened to me. He promises to find the car and buy it back, to make things right. He says he'll work 2 jobs if he has to, he'll do anything to fix this. But I don't think I can forgive him for this. It's not just about the money, although losing $75,000 is bad enough. It's about the betrayal. He sold something irreplaceable, something that meant the world to me, all because he was too stubborn to listen to reason. He chose to trust a stranger over his wife of 12 years. The worst part is that if he had just listened to me, none of this would have happened. I tried to warn him about Beyoncé. I tried to tell him something wasn't right. But he was so caught up in his dream, so desperate to prove me wrong, that he ignored all the red flags. I can't even look at him right now. Every time I see him, I think about my dad in that car, and it breaks my heart all over again. I keep thinking about what Dad would say if he knew what happened to his precious Mustang. The car he spent 15 years restoring is now gone, sold by the man I trusted most in this world. I don't know what to do next. Clark keeps saying we can get through this together, that he'll make it up to me somehow. But how do you make up for something like this? How do you rebuild trust after such a massive betrayal? I'll update again when I figure out my next steps. Right now, I just need some time to think and process everything that's happened. Thank you all for listening and for your support. Update 2. After discovering what Clark did, I moved to my sister Amy's house. I needed space to think, to process everything that had happened. Clark kept calling and texting, sometimes hundreds of times a day. His messages ranged from desperate apologies to accusations that I was being too harsh, that I was abandoning him when he needed me most. Eventually, I blocked his number. During this time, I did a lot of research about Beyoncé. I hired a private investigator, and what he found was shocking. Her real name is Sarah Johnson, and she has quite a history. She's done the same scam to at least 3 other people in different states. She targets people who dream of opening restaurants or bakeries, poses as a chef, gains their trust, and then disappears with their money. In Detroit, she scammed a retired teacher out of $40,000 by promising to help him open an Italian restaurant. In Chicago, she convinced a couple to invest $60,000 in a fake catering business. She even did this in Seattle, taking $85,000 from a woman who wanted to open a cafe. She changes her name each time. She's been Sarah, Beyoncé, Maria, and Jennifer. She always claims to be a chef with an impressive background, and she always disappears when she gets the money. The police are involved now, but they say it's unlikely they'll catch her. She's good at covering her tracks, and by the time people realize they've been scammed, she's usually already in another state with a new identity. Yesterday, I finally took action. I met with a lawyer and served Clark with divorce papers and a lawsuit for the value of my father's car. My lawyer says we have a strong case since the car was my inheritance and Clark had no right to sell it without my consent. The car was specifically left to me in my father's will, which makes Clark's unauthorized sale illegal. We're asking for $100,000, $75,000 for the car's value plus $25,000 in emotional damages. Clark's brother Mike reached out to me, begging me to reconsider the lawsuit. He said Clark is already in debt from the bakery scam. Apparently, Clark has to pay back the $20,000 he borrowed from Mike, plus he took out a personal loan of $10,000 for equipment that was never delivered. But I don't care about Clark's financial problems. He needs to face the consequences of his actions. He didn't just lose a car, he stole and sold something irreplaceable, something that meant everything to me. He betrayed my trust in the worst possible way. Clark's family is divided on the issue. His parents called me, saying I'm being vindictive and that I should stand by my husband during this difficult time. They said Clark was just following his dreams and that he suffered enough by losing all that money. His sister, on the other hand, is on my side. She said what Clark did was unforgivable and that she would have done the same thing in my position. My own family is fully supporting my decision. My sister Amy reminds me daily that this isn't just about the car, it's about respect, trust, and honesty, all of which Clark completely disregarded. My brother offered to help pay for the lawyer, saying Dad would have wanted me to fight for his car. The hardest part in all of this is realizing that my marriage is over. Not because of the money lost, but because I can't trust Clark anymore. How can I ever trust someone who would sell something so precious to me behind my back? Someone who would dismiss my concerns and trust a stranger over his own wife? Someone who would take my inheritance and turn it into his personal gambling chip? Clark sent me a long email yesterday, saying he started seeing a counselor to work on his issues. He said he realizes now that he was so caught up in his dream that he lost sight of what really mattered. He asked for another chance, saying we could rebuild our relationship, and that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. But it's too late for apologies. Some betrayals you just can't come back from, and this is one of them. I told my lawyer to proceed with both the divorce and the lawsuit. Clark made his choices, and now he has to live with the consequences. I'll update again once there's more news about the divorce proceedings or the lawsuit. Thank you all for your support during this difficult time. Update 3: after months of back and forth, the divorce is finally settled. Clark didn't contest it, which made things easier. As for the lawsuit over my dad's car, we reached a settlement. Clark agreed to pay me $100,000 in monthly installments over the next 5 years. He's had to take a second job as a night security guard to manage the payments, but that's not my problem. He made his choices, and now he has to deal with the consequences. The private investigator I hired managed to track down my dad's car. The new owner is a classic car collector in Oregon. When the PI told me this, I immediately reached out to the collector and explained the situation. I told him about my dad, how he spent 15 years restoring the car, and how it was sold without my consent. The collector was sympathetic but wasn't willing to sell the car back. He said he had already invested another $20,000 in additional restoration work. However, the collector did send me photos of the car and promised to keep me updated about any major changes or if he ever decides to sell it. At least I know the car is being well taken care of. He even invited me to come see it if I'm ever in Oregon. It's not the same as having the car in my garage, but it's better than not knowing where it ended up. Clark's family is still trying to convince me to forgive him. His mother calls me every week, telling me how depressed Clark is, how he's lost weight, how he can barely sleep. She says he's really suffering now, working 2 jobs, living in a tiny apartment, eating nothing but ramen noodles. Mike, his brother, told me Clark cries every time he sees a vintage car on the street. But their attempts to make me feel guilty aren't working. Where was their concern when Clark was selling my inheritance behind my back? Where were they when he was ignoring my warnings about Beyoncé? They seem to forget that Clark's suffering is entirely self-inflicted. The police still haven't caught Beyoncé/Sarah. They found evidence that she's done this same scam in 2 more cities since disappearing with Clark's money. She seems to target people like Clark, dreamers who are naive and too trusting. The detective handling the case said she's probably already moved on to her next victim under a new name. I'm moving to Seattle next month. I got a job offer from a bigger bank with better pay and better opportunities for advancement. My sister thinks a fresh start is exactly what I need, and I agree. I've already found an apartment, and I'm looking forward to building a new life away from all this drama. Clark sent me one final letter before I changed my address. He wrote about how sorry he was, how he realizes now that he destroyed something precious that can never be replaced. He said losing me was a worse punishment than any amount of money he has to pay back. Part of me felt sad reading his words, remembering the man I married, but then I remembered sitting in my empty garage where Dad's car used to be. Sometimes the best way to deal with betrayal is to leave it all behind and start over. That's what I'm doing. New city, new job, new life. The memories of my dad and his car will always be with me, but the pain of Clark's betrayal, that I'm leaving behind in this city along with everything else.